Before I start, I would like to ask your attention for a number of practicalities. As you will see in the panel below on your screen, and there's an icon of the world globe. If you click on this, you can choose for interpretation into Spanish and French, and you can mute the original audio. So we have 3 languages going on at the same time. This webinar will last 1.5 hours, and there will be a short space for you to come up with questions and answers at the end live. But I also would like to ask you to put your questions in the chat that I'm all the time monitoring, so you can add the questions after every round of speakers. If you want to ask, use the chat. I hope we have enough time for all the questions at the end with the facilitation of the live contributions. Please kindly indicate at the very end that you wish to do this in the chat session as well. This seminar is live streamed on YouTube as well. We will be making this webinar also available afterwards. If you want to remain anonymous while asking a question or commenting, may we please suggest you put yourself as anonymous or any other pseudonym in the Zoom profile so you can remain anonymous. Very important last element, we are committed to a civilized feminist exchange and interaction. And as organizers, we reserve, therefore, our right to exclude anyone who uses offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in an undemocratic or anti-feminist way. Those were the practical elements. Please check the chat box, open it if you haven't done it yet, because, for example, more details on both the organizers and the speakers will come up soon or are already there. Okay. For this wonderful panel called Intersectional Gender Mainstreaming in Public Policymaking, we have 3 very distinguished guest speakers. I will briefly introduce them now, but I refer to the chat for their full bio. And please, I may invite the speakers to also add anything that I am now, in the interest of time, not mentioning. Sabrina Sase is a researcher doing a PhD at the moment at the Technical University Braunschweig in cooperation with Sigmund Freud University in Berlin in Germany. And Sabrina Sase is part of the research group Quantitative Intersectionality Research, so totally linked to the topic today. Also with us as a speaker is Moana Geneve. She's a policy officer at Equinet, the European Network for Equality Bodies, specifically in charge of gender equality and other strategic equality policy issues within the network. And she has in the past worked in many different international organizations, including European Commission, the EU delegation at the UN and so forth. And also with us today is Dr. Patricia Muñoz Cabrera, and she has been combining both research and a professional career within and for public bodies and NGOs. And she's a policy advisor, evaluator, and trainer in gender equality from an international perspective. Also in many international gremia like the European Union, Council of Europe, and so forth. So I would really welcome the speakers, and we look forward to your contributions. These were my introductions of the speakers. Now I would like to tell you something about how this seminar is conducted. We will have 3 rounds where each of the speakers will make a contribution with slides and with a short video as well. As you know, an intersectional approach has been introduced in public policy making. And in this session, we will discuss examples, dilemmas, and challenges like how can we gather data from an intersectional approach? And what are common pitfalls when policymakers aim to introduce that intersectional approach? Learning from the common limitations of the gender mainstreaming approach. And how do we deal with power relations between marginalized groups and policymakers or researchers for policymaking? So those are the overall questions that we have in today's webinar. During the 3 rounds of questions, we are asking specific questions to each of the speakers, to which they will then reply. And I would like to open the very first round of questions right now. So, welcome to the first round, and may I please, Patricia, Sabrina, and Moana, ask you specific questions in this round. May I start with Patricia? What, according to you, are key elements of an intersectional approach in public policy making, if we aim for a transformative and feminist change? So what, according to you, are key elements? The floor is yours, Patricia.
Thank you, Gisela.
Sorry,
Yes.
and in the interest of time, I am going to be very strict because
Yes.
we've asked the speakers to really stick to the time. So we have questions and answer session at the very end. That is not just 3 minutes. So thank you in advance for sticking to the time. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. And please stop me if I go over. You just say, Patricia, your time is over, because we tend to get carried away. Let me just say that I'm thrilled to be with all of you. It is a real pleasure. And I hope that what I prepared can really take our minds and click our hearts and get us into a heated debate over our lived experiences and thinking on intersectionality. And may I say also, not only based on my work as an advisor, as an expert of in global arenas and institutions, but also as a person, as a human being, committed with social justice, and having been born in a country where I had to learn the hard way, in Chile. So just starting with that, I think that it's a pleasure to share with you my impressions on what, based on my professional experience, my critical thinking, and my career as an academic, I can summarize for you some of the key elements of an intersectional approach if we purport to promote a transformative policy that will do good and will be fair to everyone on the ground. These are ambitious prospects. This is quite a big paradigm we are talking about. And I want to locate the discussion as a paradigm. Is intersectionality a paradigm that brings us some step closer to social justice for everyone? Is it someone that does good to the society as a whole and to our Mother Earth? Is it something that can bring us together when everything else can separate it now? And is it something that does good and no harm? Well, let me get into some crucial issues, please. Gea, can you kindly go to slide 3, please? Gea? I think that I cannot show you number 3 because Gea is the master of this slide. But what I prepared, I have it in print. Gea, are you there?
Yeah. Can you not see the screen? Yeah, I have slide 3.
Number 3.
Yeah, number 3. Some of the key elements of an intersectional approach in public policy.
The drawing.
Yeah,
on
the
slide
drawing.
3. Yes,
Yeah?
please. Thank you.
Is it not visible, Gisela? It's not visible?
No, it's not visible. You have to put it on presentation and then move the cursor, I think. Only the first slide is visible.
Oh,
Yes.
While we are waiting for the slide to catch up, Patricia, maybe you can already list the elements.
Yes, I think the first element I put is that it is necessary to undertake a multi-level analysis. Why is this multi-level analysis, which is systemic? Also because paying homage to the suffering on the ground, if you look at the cursor on number 1, you know, normally macro policies, especially macroeconomic policies, are usually drafted in desks, removed from where the actual benefit or suffering occurs, which is in the daily lives of diverse social groups of women, men, and non-binary persons. So I think this is the first issue to take into account. A transformative intersectional policy impetus, effort should be systemic in its very design phase. At the very first level, we should be thinking, what is the big picture? What is the status of women, men, and non-binary person, groups of LGBT, IQ plus, the people with disability, migrants, people from ethnic minorities? What is our idea of human rights? Is it based only on individual entitlements? Can it also accommodate the claims of peoples like indigenous peoples of the world? So this is what we call multi-level analysis. That, number two, needs to be contextualized. It needs to be rooted in the power imbalances that produce discriminations and perpetuate inequalities on the ground. I've been all over the place with GAP2 evaluation, with some other evaluations, with gender profiles, and I still have seen that we continue to design policies removed from contextual realities, from the plight of those who are affected by the policies themselves. So this is the second main point I want to say, also because power systems are at the higher level of thinking, and intersectionality obliges us, all of us, to consider how racism, how patriarchy, how heteronormativity, how any form or system or mechanism of discrimination gets allied to other forms of discrimination to further disenfranchise those who are defined as deviant to a hegemonic norm. This is very political. It's not only policy-based, so please mark my words. It's both policy and political. We human beings are all in these issues of power imbalances, and we need to take stock of that from the design phase of a policy. And it should reflect also in quantitative data. These power imbalances should also be reflected because they also determine how a state, how a government will distribute its GDP, its national budget. Look how macro the micro level is. Who's invisible will not get a piece of the cake, to put it very bluntly. Number three, underrepresented.
Patricia,
yes.
You have 1 more minute, so
yes.
You'll have to speed it up, I'm afraid.
Yes, I will just read them. Underrepresented knowledges. The lived experience of discrimination matters, and it informs policy making, and it makes it more close to the field. So it ensures better results and coherence between the policy design, the narrative, and the livelihoods of those who are on the ground. Number four, it promotes non-binary thinking. Let us get away and eradicate binary gender mechanisms in gender mainstreaming. No, it's non-binary thinking. So the number five, complex categorization. If we follow Leslie McCall and all who came later, it includes examining how homogeneously assumed groups of women, men, and non-binary person also engage in power relations. This is what we call intra-categorical disaggregation. The number six, the short and longer term base. Later, I will come back to it. Linear approaches do not work because fluctuations on the ground are determined by conflict, and conflict means losses. Conflict means going back, backlashes. Intersectional impact assessment, number 7, is a condition sine qua non, ex ante, before and ex post. What will be the unintended consequences, positive or negatives, on those who will be impacted directly by a given policy? I'll give you one example: extractivism, land grabbing, agribusiness. The last one, recognition and redistribution. It doesn't suffice to recognize the underrepresented social groups. It is important to distribute wealth accordingly so that policies really have their specific budgets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. I think this is really an excellent start where you have already come up with 8 different elements that are key, and to also for the reminder that it is a highly political process towards social justice. So thank you very much for your contribution. May I now ask Sabrina to answer the following question: what does an intersectional approach mean for you as a researcher and trainer in terms of your approach and perspective? And as we have already noticed in the first contribution, 5 minutes is extremely short. Go, please take the floor.
Thank you very much for your invitation to this very important global network. And thank you, Gisela, for this interesting question. I agree with Patricia on the high potential.
Estoy de acuerdo con Patricia.
Do you understand me, by the way?
¿Me escuchan bien?
Because, okay. I agree with Patricia on the high potential of intersectionality and foreign perspectives for transformative change. For every change, an inspiration is needed. What is your queer feminist inspiration? What gives water to new seeds of social justice? Let me show you mine. I'm very inspired by Professor Gail Lewis. We once invited her to come for a seminar to Berlin, organized by Queer Institute, about unlearning racialized intimacies. And I loved everything: her smart brain, her warm heart, while telling us about her story, theory, and experiences, as well as how she embraced conflict and healing. Gail Lewis works
May I please interrupt you here? I think you're already looking at different slides, right? So may I ask here to move the slides?
I'm not sure which slide do you see, Gisela?
We only see the very first one at the moment.
Then we have the same.
Oh yeah, it's your screen that we're looking at. So we only look at the first one now.
Okay, my computer is faster than the internet. I'm at the next slide. I can stop it and try it again.
Yeah, you have to put it on presentation, and
Oh,
then,
I did.
And then move with the cursor, hopefully. Yeah, now we've got the third slide, the one that.
Okay, nice.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know. So here is Gail Lewis and giving water to the seeds. Let me give you a quote from her. Intersectionality, then, whether conceived as theory, concept, methodology, or heuristic, has been extraordinarily generative and has unleashed a burgeoning archive of feminist critical inquiry, including negotiations over the proper intersectional analysis, a deconstructive mode of analysis, redirecting attention away from the relational dynamics. This quote opens room for discussion, but Gail Lewis, also a psychotherapist, wouldn't be Gail Lewis if she wouldn't come along with a positive twist. So our queer feminist post-colonial plant can grow and bring us fruits, strength, and shadow in hard times. She also says, the current debates on intersectionality recall, if not repeat, many of the battles fought between Black and Asian feminists, along with their white anti-racist compañeras and white feminists who felt the struggles was being diverted by the call to pay attention to the inseparability of misogyny, racism, homophobia, and class. While there remains much to do to expand an intersectional understanding, feminism today would be all the poorer without the infighting. So bringing together what I have learned from Gail Lewis and many others, as a researcher and trainer, I am juggling many things, such as complex human identities with situated knowledge and experiences and needs from researchers, participants, interest groups who make suggestions, target groups when publishing results, and contracting authorities. This means I juggle power relations and social inequalities in institutions, also in university. I juggle underrepresented perspectives, trying to share my privileges as a researcher, giving space for many voices while trying not to be materialistic. I try steady critical self-reflection, reflecting my role in social inequalities, but also the role of the discipline, the institute I work for, the country I live in. For example, I wrote about the intersectional responsibility of German psychology due to its entanglement with colonialism and National Socialism. In conflicting intersectionality-informed debates, I try to prioritize analyzing inequality and differentiated subjectivities over playing out specific intersections. All right. Juggling is known to stimulate both hemispheres of the brain. So after juggling, I came to the conclusion that it would be best to work resource-oriented, focusing not only discrimination and equality studies, but also privileging. Therefore, I use the concept intersectional privilege awareness, as no one is only discriminated or only privileged. I understand both as fluid experiences, shifting with time and different historical and geopolitical contexts. This concept also is an effort for me as a white scientist to get some agency when doing intersectionality-informed research without appropriating a POC discourse. Coming to the next point, I agree with many feminist scientists that it is helpful to show own vulnerability. For therapy, I extended the concept location self from Sally Weedy-Watts-Jones to the concept intersectional therapeutic self-disclosure. This includes an sharing of own diverse social positionings related to intersectional experiences of privileging and discrimination, as well as clear statements regarding social justice. Self-disclosure is also important when describing the sample of your conducted study, talking about quantitative research, any field, describing researchers as part of the participants. And what I have also learned from the juggling, I try to make myself a research object, flipping perspectives using your situated knowledge. For example, me, a queer person born in a country that doesn't exist anymore, the old GDR, was part of a research group together with Ernest and Lee, born in Western Germany, a research group on lesbian activity and activism in the GDR. We produced a sound collage and an article with interviews. You can read it on the link below in German, English, Russian, and Polish. Our contribution is part of the current international exhibition Love at First Fight, Queer as German Folk, in cooperation with Goethe Institute and Schwules Museum, Gay Museum. We had stations in USA, Mexico, Canada, and Poland till now. Okay, now coming to the end, where I'm still struggling is if we can capture intersectionality as a social competency. Is it more than multicultural competency or diversity competency, or is it mainly an attitude shaping everything else? I really want to discuss this with you later in the Q&A. If you have thoughts on it or maybe conduct work on this field, please write me a message. And now, before giving back the word to Lisa, let me quickly show you the literature I used so you can find it in the online video. Sorry for talking so much. An intersectional approach is nothing quick, that's for sure.
Thank you very much, Sabrina Sasse. That is very helpful because after the general introduction of Patricia Munoz Cabrera, we now have a very good insight in what an intersectional approach would mean from a research perspective. So thank you very much. Also for highlighting the question intersectionality maybe as a social competency for the future discussion. May I now, as the last speaker in this first round, ask Moana Genevieve to take the floor. And the question I have for you is, do you see any differences or similarities in how activists, so civil society, works with an intersectional approach as compared to public bodies? How can cooperation between them successfully implement an intersectional approach? May I ask you to give your views on this question?
Thank you very much. Yes, I don't have a PowerPoint and I'll try to be brief. Basically, you're asking about public bodies, and I just want to clarify that I'm working for the European Network of Equality Bodies. I don't know if everybody here knows what they are, so just a quick reminder is always good to be on the same page. Equality bodies are public, independent institutions which are defending victims of discrimination. They don't just do that, they also do data collection, policy advice, they do reports and studies, and it's mandatory to have at least one equality body in all countries in the EU, because it's based on EU directives. So if you're from the EU, you have an equality body in your country. In Germany, it would be the Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency, for instance. So just to have a better understanding of what I'll be speaking about when I say equality bodies. Otherwise, regarding your questions on the difference that you can see between activists and civil society and also public bodies, and on how they work on an intersectional approach, what are the differences and similarities? From my personal experience, I see that activists have an approach to intersectionality that is closer often to the historical meaning of the concept. We know that Kimberlé Crenshaw, which invented the concept, developed it primarily to encapsulate the reality of Black women in America. So it was really the goal was to give these women a legal tool to fight a specific type of injustice they were facing. And I've noticed from many activists a very justified criticism, which is that the institutionalization of intersectionality also sometimes emptied the notion from its racial perspective. And when I am in contact with activists, or also when I'm not working for Equinet, when I'm in my free time as an activist myself, I see this need of reinvindicate the fact that intersectionality is primarily a tool to fight the intersection of classism, racism, and sexism. Of course, there are other intersections there, but they are the core intersections that needs to be focused on. And it's true that from other institutions, this is not necessarily the case. There is a bit of an emptying of the racialized meaning of intersectionality sometimes. The difference with the public bodies, such as equality bodies, is that these bodies are legal entities. One of their bread and butter is often to provide legal advice to victims of discrimination. So equality bodies have a more legalistic approach to the concept of intersectionality that is often also read in comparison with multiple discrimination, or often the two concepts are connected or merged. And they also have a wider approach to the concept of intersectionality. So when we ask for intersectional cases from equality bodies, they would say, oh, we have a case regarding an older woman. We consider that intersectionality. They look at various grounds of discrimination, and when these grounds combine, they consider this an intersectional case. And as it comes to other bigger institutions, such as the European Commission, for instance, or European institutions in general, one critique that can be made, or that is often heard from civil society organizations, is that the word intersectionality is really used as a buzzword, something that is put in policies. Like from 2020, there's been many equality policies issued by the European Commission on LGBTIQ equality, on gender equality, an action plan against racism, a disability strategy, a Roma framework, and all these policies were using the term intersectionality, but it's not very clear what's meant there. With intersectionality, it does not look like there is an intersectional policy-making approach, or if there is, it's not necessarily very blatant. What's often said about these policies is that intersectionality is there. There is a will from the European Commission to integrate intersectionality in their policy making, but the word is just used as a buzzword to replace inclusion and diversity, and it does not necessarily goes deeper than that. And intersectional policymaking has to be deeper than just mentioning the concept of intersectionality in a policy paper. So how to cooperate? One key issue.
Moana, you will have to do the cooperation in 1 minute.
Okay, I'll do that very quickly. One key issue that are faced by equality bodies in general in their work is the issue of underreporting. There are cases there are inequalities, there are cases of intersectional discrimination, but it's not necessarily brought to their knowledge. And a big and clear cooperation that can be done is that NGOs and civil society have better access to marginalized and vulnerable groups and to victims of intersectional discrimination. And on the opposite side, equality bodies are lacking cases of intersectional discrimination. So one cooperation that can be done is NGOs and civil society going to equality bodies and bringing them cases of intersectional discrimination, because they have access to marginalized groups that wouldn't necessarily trust a public institution. And another case is, of course, for equality bodies, when they do policy advice on inequalities, to always consult NGOs for intersectional, for cases of to include intersectionality, because of course intersectionality is not just about individual discrimination, it's a broader social issue. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Moana Genevieve. I know we have a lot to say, and we have to do it in very little time. So thank you all very much. I'm speeding you up. I think this was definitely a very valued contribution, also extremely pragmatic, which I really appreciate, with very specific elements to be picked up at the end, namely the inclusion for NGOs and organizations that do have much better access to marginalized groups that public policymakers may not immediately have, and to go deeper than just a buzzword, as well as making sure that we have the full breadth of the intersectionality concept as a whole. As an end to this first round, I would like to say, in answering some of the questions that have come up, that this seminar is recorded and it will be available on YouTube. Afterwards, a paper will be published on the basis of this seminar, so keep your eyes peeled on the two organizers of this seminar, the Frederick Ebert Foundation as well as White Plus, and we will ask later if the panelists are ready to share their presentations. So if you are really keen, please keep your eyes peeled on that as well. We will do the best to share as much as possible. Clara Park mentioned that it would be also interesting to have methodological aspects in view of promoting this approach in public policy making, and I agree, and maybe this can be the subject of another seminar, although this is the last in the series of this one. So thank you very much for all of you for your wonderful contributions in round one, and for your comments in the chat section. I remind everyone, maybe you came late, if you have a question or if you want to make a comment, please use the chat box. That makes us very good in the sense that we are now coming to the end of round one, and we will continue the discussion on intersectional gender mainstreaming and public policy making with the second round of questions to our distinguished speakers. So I would like to open round number 2 of questions with the first one, Sabrina Sasa. I would like to ask you, how can we gather and analyze quantitative data from an intersectional perspective? As you know, we are asking about quantitative data because a lot of policymakers prefer that type of analysis and data, and not very much the qualitative data that usually come out. So may I please hear what your reply would be to this question. Sabrina, may I invite you to take the floor?
Thank you, Gisela. In 5 minutes, it's quite an effort. I think I skip the statistics then. To give the punchline, the paradigm of intersectionality tries to overcome additive analysis, and quantitative research is using additive statistic models. Yes, but additive statistic models summarize both additive and multiplicative arithmetic, and therefore an additive statistical model can well suit the intersectional demand to not only add up social categories. Still, lots of aspects need to be considered when conducting an intersectionality-informed study. Elizabeth Cole gave an overview about all research stages of an intersectionality-informed study. Each stage is guided by 3 questions. Who is included within the category? What role does inequality play? And where are the similarities?
Sabrina, I'm only seeing the first slide. Yeah, so...
No worries, I tried again. Can you now see a table?
Yes, now it's much better. Thank you.
Okay, so you didn't miss much. So the 3 questions which guide every stage of the research process is who is included within this category, what role does inequality play, and where are the similarities? Let me show you easy steps for a beginning. I hope you can see the next slide now.
Yes,
as mentioned before, when describing the sample of a study, also the researchers should be mentioned with demographic information and how their social positions might affect each stage of a research process. I brought you a best practice example from Burkhardt and colleagues. And beside demographic information about the interviewers, you can find in the lower part, because biases of the research team may influence the interviews or analysis of the data, the researchers documented and discussed their biases and expectations regarding several aspects of the study. So we can see the self-reflections also like very transparent in the study. Let's talk about intersectionality-informed operationalization. This practice example is found in a study from Les Migras, a social psychological center for lesbian migrants in Germany. The study examined the experiences of violence and multiple discrimination from lesbian and bisexual women and trans people in Germany. Using their situated knowledge and their expertise from their NGO and communities, they made themselves a research object, and no wonder that they have made careful intersectionality-informed self-concept-based operationalization for gender, sexual orientation, and migration background and multiple discrimination. As time is running out for today, I can only put a spotlight on how they have operationalized gender. The questionnaire was in German, I translated it for you. So talking about gender, for me, it's interesting to see that you have many options, that they state it's a personal feeling, what kind of category you cross, and that you have more options to decide on. And I really like the option, I refuse to categorize myself. I also like that they ask in the next step also about gender. In daily life, it can happen that we are not perceived and treated in line with our gender self-concept because the environment can't categorize it or doesn't respect it. So how often do your self-chosen gender is recognized usually? So you can cross never, sometimes, mostly, or always. For examining the gender self-concept, Wengerud and colleagues introduced, for example, the fuzzy gender concept. Here, self-assessed intensity of femininity and masculinity is surveyed on Likert scales based on the respondents' own presuppositions, which can also be stereotypical, of course. So this integrates a level of gender role into quantitative research and may reveal a difference from the biological category. Now we have talked about gender. for intersectionality-informed quantitative research, not only are social difference categories themselves relevant as variables, but also variables that can map social, historical, and geopolitical circumstances of life. They're called context variables, or also called solution-focused variables. And in Germany, where I live in and work in, there exists a data gap for a profound equality monitoring due to simplified operationalizations of variables. Baumann and colleagues found in 2018 that in 20 examined social scientific population surveys, social categories referring to discrimination were not or only partly gathered through the utilized variables and their operationalization. The good news, in 2020, the Afro census was filling this research gap. It is the biggest survey among Black, African, and Afro-diasporic people in Germany till now. I know the descriptions are German, but I was inspired by the graphics and wanted to show them to you. I think you get the picture. And then maybe let me summarize my idea here for the question from Gisela. For an intersectionality-informed quantitative analysis, the following aspects are of relevance: examining the impact of identity variables and the differentiated combinations to take multidimensionality of identities into account, examining heterogeneity of each identity variable to avoid essentialism of intersectional subgroups, including identity-related context variables on micro and macro level to prevent individualization of societal phenomenon, and focusing mediation and moderation effects to prevent simplifying causalities. For more detailed information on intersectionality-informed statistical analysis, I need you to ask to check the literature as my 5 minutes are over. Of course, you can also write me an email for more information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina Sasa. That was a very good insight in from the research perspective on what could be possible key aspects there. The next speaker that I may invite is Moana. What can we learn from concrete examples of an intersectional approach in public policy?
Thank you for giving me the floor again. First of all, I'd like to say that concrete examples of intersectional policymaking are quite hard to find. I've been asked in a meeting by a policymaker if we as equality bodies had examples, but it's not very common, and it's something that in the theory is there is like the language, but putting intersectionality in practice is difficult. Also because, as I said, it is used by some policymakers as a buzzword, but it requires in practice very deep efforts and to reshape the way we make policies. So I have a quick list on how to make policy making more intersectional. So policymakers can collect disaggregated equality data. I'm not going to go into details there because we've just had a presentation on the topic, but basically the goal is to increase the visibility of issues faced by people experiencing intersectional inequalities. So disaggregated data should not be limited to gender and age, but at least include data on race and ethnicity, as well as socioeconomic status. And when it comes to gender, it should have a focus on gender diversity rather than gender equality, and include a non-binary perspective there, of course. Another thing that can be done is to use inclusive policy language and to name the norm to adequately reflect on the variety of lived experiences in Europe. For example, when couples are mentioned, it should be said that this is that what is mentioned is an heterosexual couple or a couple in a queer couple, because usually some policy makers would mention couples, but they would imply heterosexual couples, but couples in reality encompass a very wide reality. So that's something that should be encouraged, is to really name the norm that is used and kind of be as inclusive as possible in the policy language, also regarding the gender binary and going beyond the gender binary in policy language, for instance. Another thing that can be done is to assess if a policy takes into account the needs and problems faced by the most marginalized groups of societies. This is a very strong indicator to evaluate the intersectional aspect of policies. Policymakers have to really ask themselves if the policies that they're implementing will reach and help the most marginalized group. If not, it's not an intersectional policy. And how to evaluate that is the best way is to set up a very inclusive and participatory policy process where the people affected by a policy are considered as the main source of knowledge to inform policy making. Policymakers can organize wide consultations with civil society and affected communities, but also, and most importantly, directly involve them in the policy making process. And a corollary of that is to encourage policymakers to be representative themselves of the diversity of society. When you look at who's making law, often it's a very homogeneous representation of society. It's very white, it's very binary, it's very straight, it's very, it's often men, cis men. And it's also from a very a social economic status that is very homogeneous. So pushing for representativity in policymakers themselves could also push for better intersectional policies. Another tip is to develop intersectionality mainstreaming on the model of gender mainstreaming, where all aspects of a policy, designing, implementation, and evaluation integrate an intersectional perspective. And finally, is to enable existing equality bodies to monitor the intersectional aspect of laws and policies. This includes adding intersectional provisions in equality legislation and granting equality bodies with adequate resources, because it's good that a policy is considered intersectional, but it's even better that it's implemented in an intersectional way. And there's always a difference between what's on paper and what's in practice, and monitoring is key in there.
Thank you very much, Joanna Genevieve. That was extremely practical and also based, I think, very much in the realities as you have seen them in your experience, and with your expertise. And I think it ties in very nicely with what Patricia Muñoz Cabrera said in the very first contribution, that this is also a highly political process, because it is supposed to include marginalized groups, making them far more center stage in policy making, and making sure there is a participatory process, which is of course not the first thing that is on policymakers' minds very often. So continuing on that, I would like to give the floor now to Patricia. What are common limitations and challenges that policymakers and the consultants and researchers that assist them sometimes have when they draft and implement an intersectional approach? Could you please tell us something about that? Oh, Patricia, you have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Yes, I'm glad to see that we are kind of building a collective thinking on intersectionality from different areas and entry points as well. Also, I found very interesting the examples that Sabrina gave and Moana gave as well, because these are common challenges I have been facing and accompanying institutions to really deal with them, to tackle them, like the Council of Europe. I have seen some evolution. I think progress is very little, but throughout the years, in the past 10 years, I have seen some small steps. The road is still very long. I think that, may I just say one word of caution? I don't think, personally, based on my experience and my PhD on intersectionality, that focus on identities solve the complex equation on how intersecting discriminations operate on the daily lives of embodied subjects who are per se so diverse. So I think that identities need to be matched with some sort of recognition of the systemic powers, the ideologies, the driving forces, the underlying factors that reproduce them. I think that this is the core of intersectionality, because it's the comfort zone is that an institution will focus only on identities. So we either added or imbricated or intersected, we remain on the discussion of identities. But to give you one example, in France, it is illegal to ask the race of a person. In Brazil, it is incorporated in how the state plans policies to distribute, to invest the budgeting part. So we have the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics. I invite you to see the data. I will show it in the policy paper as an example of a state that thought about the concrete operations of racism, of patriarchy, of heteronormativity by producing data, statistics that are crossed and that tell you how a Black or white, poor peasant woman fares vis-a-vis an urban woman of the same typology, if I may say. So there we have a comparative analysis that makes sense, that come close to the complex reality of discrimination on the ground. This is one point I want to say. The next slide, Gea, please. And also, as Kimberly Crenshaw reminds us, identities move beyond them and also prepare remedial.
Sorry, Patricia, for interrupting,
Yes.
but we only see the very first slide. So we need to take some action.
Gea, I think, or I will continue. Just an entry point to remind ourselves that, as Kimberly Crenshaw argued, it was in Frankfurt when I met her some years ago on intersectionality, a special issue, and she said we need to tackle the systems of power that disenfranchise, disempower some groups, and seek that a policy proposes remedial measures. Not only statistics, remedial measures. How do we correct the equation of social injustice that happens on the ground? The next point I want to raise is that, no, that's not the Gea, it's the previous slide, sorry, the limitations. The most frequent limitation I have come across all over the world, in Europe, Council of Europe, European delegation, foreign policy instruments, etc., member states, is the lack of intersectionally disaggregated data. It stops at one point, 2 variables, 2, and then it goes nowhere beyond that. Also, there are few integrated data systems that tells us how inequalities are operating for multiply discriminated or intersectionally discriminated subjects on the ground. Third, it is difficult to collect data on identities, especially on non-binary subjects or social groups. And in Honduras, there is an observatory that is producing data and is informing data to the International Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the United Nations regionally. So I will share this provision of data, the documents. They are also preparing qualitative data on the narratives as per country. 10 countries have joined forces, and it is NGOs cooperating with international institutions, and also some courts in respective countries. The next point I wanted to raise is the issue of unpacking oppressed knowledges. I think that there is a lot happening on the ground, Moana. I was glad when you mentioned that they draft policies in a desk, but everywhere I have been on the ground. In Bangladesh, I just finished a gender profile for the European Union delegation, and they are producing intersectional data. The hydras, I will show later, what they have produced is telling us a story that the government has brought into the major country policy. I will show you later, still with many challenges, but something is happening there. So we have moved forward. There is data also on how indigenous women and men and non-binary indigenous subjects are faring regarding intersecting discrimination. And this data is being compiled by UN in different countries. So I think there we are also moving a bit further in the production of data, quantitative and qualitative. One of the things I have noticed also is we are still in added value. I am reading on limitations. There is a lot of resistance. There is a lot of resistance by policymakers to move. I'm reading something else. Gea, please, it's slide the previous one. Okay. It was resistance to move the gender mainstreaming approach. It has become so ingrained. It took so many decades to get gender mainstreaming as a step towards equality between only men and women. It was binary thinking, we agree, but it was at least something that gave a canvas to fight for non-patriarchal policy making. Now, what is the next step? What is the canvas, the analytical, the statistical, the political canvas that will take us further in our struggle towards intersecting disaggregation, intersectional analysis that is really, really genuinely transformative. So that maps out the complexities of discriminations as they happened on the ground. The second one is that it only relates to women from different backgrounds. So we keep women in focus. We stick to women because women are more vulnerable. This socially or policy constructed idea of women as suffering more, which I'm not saying they don't, but the issue is be comparative, be contrastive, be also contextual and situated. And the last one is that it is perceived as time-consuming, as burdensome, and we cannot include everyone. So there is a heavy burden on policymakers and also lack of capacity building to raise awareness. I think Moana also mentioned that. Resistance often is yes, someone says expensive, but it pays off better at the end. I will show you later with one example. It pays off because it will give us a closer mapping of how intersecting discriminations operate on the ground, which will facilitate public investment. And in the long run, the spillover effects, the impact will be bigger because at grassroots level, subjects, men, women, non-binary person, they live in more community-based organizations. They are more collective than we are in some areas of the world. So we see in rural spaces, they have an idea of collective well-being, of collective buen vivir, that is a stepping stone to transforming something. And that doesn't cost anything. We just need to tap on that. So I will put it there because I think I've come to my time.
Yes.
Gisela.
Thank you very much, Patricia, because you have 1 minute left and we're already going over.
Yes. Yes, no, the other one was the added value, but you already saw it. I would only just invite ourselves to reflect on how do we balance focus on identities or categorizing and also the narrative on transformative change that is required to make a data be meaningful to everyone and fair, by the way.
Thank you very much, Patricia. It's a pity that we didn't have a lot of time to discuss that slide that we saw first. We'll try and see what we can do to share later. I think this was very important because you come from a position where you have very specific expertise and experience with a lot of organizations. And as someone in the text box, in the chat box already wrote, like in institutions, including here for myself in the European Union, it's a hard struggle to even have sex disaggregated data still, and to have the money and the time to invest in that. And I agree with you, then the question is, while that struggle is continuing, if we look at it from an intersectional approach, what is the next step? And I think this seminar gives us a number of very concrete elements that can be to the benefit of us all. Now, I will have to speed the speakers up in the third round. I'm now going to be very strict, otherwise we have not a single minute left for questions and answers at the end. The topic of the seminar is still intersectional gender mainstreaming in public policy making. And the third round of questions has 3 elements for Moana, Sabrina, and of course for Patricia. And Moana, I would like to ask, how can activists change the action of public policy makers so that it becomes more inclusive? So may I please ask you all to be extremely brief. I'm sorry to do this, but otherwise we have nothing. So Moana, can I please ask you to take the floor first?
I'll be brief. So you were asking, how can activists change the action of public policy makers towards working of a more inclusive, intersectional, diverse approach? I think for me, the first important word is accountability. First of all, internal accountability. I think when working on intersectionality, activists themselves need to check if their own NGO as an intersectional functioning, because it's a very good exercise for themselves, I think, to also understand how you can make your organization work this way, but also how to project it externally. And that means asking yourself basic question: who speaks in your organization? Who has visibility? Who's in power? Does it have a proper internal structure to look at the intersectionality of all the decisions that are made? There are organizations with, for instance, an intersectionality committee, which will look at all the decisions that are made and make some sort of intersectional mainstreaming within the NGO. So I think that's a very basis, is to look inward from NGOs and civil society organization. Another thing, accountability is also external. So even when institutions claim that they are diverse, it's not necessarily the case, or even when they say that they're doing intersectional policymaking, it's not necessarily the case. So fostering accountability and looking at the visibility and the representation within policy makers and within public organizations is a key as well, I think. And looking at diversity, visibility, who's speaking, who's in charge as well. I think that's something that can be done with campaigns and with monitoring on policy makers. I want to talk about a very specific example, and then I'll stop speaking. But in France, for instance, which is my home country, there is a form of intersectionality backlash, where the very mention of intersectionality is problematic. You have people on the media going on TV and explaining that intersectional activists are a threat to the well-being of the unity of the French nation, and etc. and etc. So there's many ways of tackling this, but I think one is that it's very important to educate the public about intersectionality, so that when you hear that kind of discourse, you can have counter arguments, because recalling that intersectionality is a scholarly term used by experts on equalities, which aims at improving the situation of all, but especially people that are at the margin, that are vulnerable and that are marginalized. I think it's very key to recall that intersectionality does not come of thin air, contrary to some concepts that are used by the extreme right, that they come out of thin air. Intersectionality has a scholar and an academic root, and it's really used by experts in the equality field to better tackle intersectional discrimination, but also to improve overall the equality and to lessen inequalities in general. And it's a tool, and it's not something that's out of nowhere. I think it's very important that the public has this notion to better understand what is intersectionality.
Thank you very much, Moana Geneve. I think that is very important what you have just contributed, because that is what is happening also in the political realities in many of the countries where we live. Okay, thank you very much. I will now ask the next question to Sabrina. What can researchers do to bridge the power imbalances between many public policymakers and the marginalized groups that we discussed before? Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Gisela. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, only the first slide though.
Okay, I will start with the first one then. All right, as researchers, we indeed have a bridging function between individual, structural, and discursive level to influence policy making. I agree with Patricia on the importance of rising awareness, and also with Moana on the importance of different levels of accountability. Especially in my field, psychology and health studies, but also all other disciplines, they offer many ways for bridging the gap. So now I'm curious if you can see my second slide. Is it different, the slide? No. Okay, I stop it again and start it again. You can't see it. It's interesting.
No, I think you have to share the screen again.
Okay, so.
Yeah, it says you have started.
Okay.
If you put it on present and then move the cursor, usually it works.
I skip the cursor and I hope you can see it soon. So here are some examples how to use our position. Approaches and concepts using the paradigm of intersectionality can do more justice to human complexity, shaping new ways of data gathering and analysis. We can provide data about consequences of discrimination, such as decreased psychological and physical health, or decreased access to paid jobs, healthcare, or other support systems. We have the ability to change academic institutions, let's call it internal policymaking, through mainstreaming intersectionality-informed topics in teams, classes, theses, publications, interviews, funding applications, recruitment for jobs, and conferences. We heard it before from Moana, #visibility. We need to foster participatory research in each step of the study, allowing marginalized perspectives, not groups. Remember, no one is only discriminated or privileged, allowing marginalized perspectives to take part and give feedback and guidance. Therefore, we also need to consider NGO suggestions from interest group and communities. So, for example, at my time at the UN, the population unit of UNED, Economic Commission for Europe, we promoted mainstreaming aging regarding discrimination of elderlies, lifelong learning, and best practice examples. For example, for education for elderlies, where Georgia could show off with great infrastructure. There was also the Active Aging Index developed. The Active Aging Index is a tool to measure the untapped potential of older people for active and healthy aging across countries. It measures the level to which older people live independent, healthy, secure lives, participate in paid employment and social activities, as well as their capacity to active age. As mainstreaming aging was a challenge back then, of course, a more intersectional perspective needs to be adapted. But as you can see, mainstreaming specific forms of discrimination or identity dimensions is not a new phenomenon. So we can also talk with policymakers about a continuous survey or something. In my classes at universities, I teach explicitly about intersectionality and its relevance to the specific subject or discipline. I motivate students to put an intersectional lens on their theses, for example. Moreover, I am part of a working group on intersectional quantitative research from Humboldt University Berlin, which was started by my colleague Katharina Jacke. As policymakers used to trust quantitative data, as researchers, we can both bring intersectionality into quantitative studies, for example, through more context variables and ensuring that marginalized perspectives are taken into account when conceptualizing studies. And we can also reach out for samples where we can promote a mixed method approach, for example, where quantitative research is enriched with qualitative perspectives. Of course, I take part in conferences and classes myself to learn and unlearn things. And this way I try to expand my academic activist network, aiming at allyship and solidarity. That's why it shows a picture where the Power Rangers sit on my arm. Do you know the US American TV series Power Ranger? It's an adaptation from the Japanese Super Sentai series, where the main characters are a team working together against a hostile organization. So I imagine a future where researchers, activists, policymakers have very diverse identities and work together for a just, queer feminist, post-colonial and post-migration society. Okay, and now I'm curious for the last question, which will be answered, I think, by Patricia then. Okay, thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much, Sabrina. Patricia will be the last speaker in the third round, and the questions are, could you please highlight some strategies that have been put forward by women from the ground and policymakers, and what has that achieved? So you are the last speaker of the third round.
Thank you very much, Gisela, and also to my colleagues for these very fascinating discussions. It's a pity the three of us cannot really connect or communicate, but I want to show with one image. This is the image. Again, many thanks. I want to summarize my insights into one experience I had of a very important long-term study for the European Union in Bangladesh. And something that really got me into thinking was about strategies, about complexities, about collaboration. I don't dare to say co-construction of an intersectional policy, but at least the first seeds of policy dialogues between invisible embodied subjects, the hijras, they are called third gender persons in Bangladesh, who are the last of the last in the, if I may say, hierarchy of marginalization. So the long study took us, the methodology was intersectional, so we developed all the frameworks, the tables, the analytical canvas, and then we interviewed different social groups: Rohingyas, internally displaced persons, rural Rohingyas, non-binary persons in rural and urban areas, young and old, persons with disabilities. So we try to cover an important array of humanity to really provide a mapping that could be close to what Bangladesh is: situated, construction of knowledges, and participatory. The persons were building it up as we were interviewing them. The experience of the hijras is that after decades of advocacy work, lobbying essential to transform unfair practices on the ground, they finally made it to the 8th country strategy plan with one page, a long document where many persons from different backgrounds were included, with some categorization that is still binary, if I may say, sorry, in terms of statistical data, but at least the narrative, the language, the terminology was intersectional. They don't use intersectionality. This is another point I want to make. We should not expect our Western terminology, even as emancipatory as it is, to be rightly adopted by other constituencies, by other contexts. This would be in itself a contradiction to intersectionality, which ambitions to eradicate hierarchies, to eradicate this scale of epistemologies where we tend to think that everything that the Western has produced is better than what the global South is producing. So here I'm calling ourselves as well to really be more self-examining, which we are, on the knowledge that we produce and how repressed, minoritized knowledges are not validated, where decision-making is made on which knowledge will be retained in a given policy. The Hydras had never been able to have their voices on paper, to put it simply. They do now. So they were also officially recognized in 2013 by a governmental circular, which is a policy in progress, as third person, which entitles them to rights, access to services, access to health, access to labor markets. Problem, no law has been still drafted. No policy has been implemented. I want to also raise our attention to the lack of implementation of a policy, whether it is gender sensitive or whether it is intersectionally sensitive. Many policies stay on paper. Beautiful theorizing, beautiful narratives, never with no budget. Many policies we found out didn't have a budget allocated to it. They were not known by local authorities, by local decision makers, by NGOs, by population. So the Hydras, in strategic coalition building with NGOs, with women's rights organizations, with human rights organizations, they rocked the boat. They made it to the country plan, the multi-annual plan. They now at least have an official document ensuring their rights. And I think that this is something, imagine that the economic division of the Ministry of Finance had to talk to them, had to listen to them, and had to put them, no, not yet gay. I think I will present only the first case of the Hydras in Bangladesh. So there was a dialogue. There was a critical dialogue that the study created. There was this space for local authorities, for national policymakers, for financial and central banks to discuss with them, at least to hear them. And this is where we are. I think that this is a very small step. I found this example so revealing, and also because of the law, we need to consider other factors perpetuating some inequalities. And I think that religious, faith-based tendencies in a country play an important role. We will not have the time to discuss with us, but intersectionality also encourages us to think what is the faith-based system in which policy making is designed and implemented. Bangladesh is officially a Muslim country. So any deviance from a binary sexual practice or even identity is considered sodomy. So it's punished by law. This is why intersectionality may not be the term, but gender and diversity may be a term, an entry point that would resonate with policymakers in a more meaningful way. So this translation of a term when it travels is important. Redefining terminology, deconstructing also our own terms, and rethinking before we go into the place on what we are going to use, the language we want to transform, or the language to communicate as a researcher or as an advisor. I'm talking to myself right now. So I need to constantly deconstruct my own mindset in order for me to properly operate in this complex and intersectionally discriminated world I inhabit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. This was, I think, also an excellent way to end the third round. again, with an emphasis on, from your one, with a very practical example, which I think we all appreciate as well, and also the importance of highlighting that one thing is the analysis, but the other thing, and narratives and lovely policies, but the other thing is implementing those policies. That brings us to the end of our third round. I think we've covered a whole lot of ground. I will now go for the last few minutes to the audience. If you have a question to any of the panelists, please put it in the chat box. In the meantime, I would like to highlight something that Clara Park added, which is we need convincing arguments for policymakers to see the benefits of intersectional analysis and approaches. And I think that's very key because Patricia, especially in one of your presentations, you highlighted that as well, that in the long run, an inclusive approach has an impact on better quality policies. And indeed, if we include marginalized groups, that will cover a larger group of the population, of the citizens. And this is a very highly political question that brings up questions about serious democracy and serious inclusion from an intersectional perspective as well. I would like to thank Marta Salazar also for raising the elements in the different speeches that she has very much appreciated. Thank you. She has specific questions, but they are very elaborate to answer, I think, like reflecting on the way of decolonizing language. So I think we can pick that up in the discussions that may follow at another point. Let me see, and for the rest I see a lot of thanks. That means that at this point we don't have a specific question from the audience for you as panelists. That means I can now start wrapping up this extremely valuable last webinar on intersectional gender mainstreaming in public policy making. I want to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed your contributions as well, in the sense that I am sitting in a reality where here in Kiev and the European Union, sex disaggregated data and policies about women are already a very big thing and a struggle that is a daily reality. And then intersectionality is indeed a goal to strive for. And I think this panel gives us a very concrete as well as analytical elements of what is important. And if I go back to the general questions that we asked about intersectional approach in public policy, we have covered ground on gathering data. For example, I think what is very important is to remember that some of you mentioned this several times, accountability and data for more justice. And also in that sense, participatory research, which as an anthropologist, of course, is very close to my heart. And it is something that we should strive for, to include, especially also in the research and quantitative data gathering, not only a theoretical intersectional approach, but also in practice, and to make sure that it is participatory and includes the various compounded, discriminated groups. We also have said quite a lot about the common pitfalls in the various presentations, of course, the pragmatic ones, but also the more theoretical ones, because we do come from a feminist background and we have done decades of work on sex disaggregated data and including a gender perspective in public policy making, struggle still continuing. And I think indeed, we have to be very specific on what are the next steps when we speak about intersectionality and what does it mean in practice. I think the other element that we dealt with in our presentations are how to deal with the power relations between marginalized groups and policymakers. And I think the last example, very pragmatic example of the hijras in Bangladesh was a very great example of a very practical way of doing this. And I also remind people of different things that have been said, for example, by Moana, lived experience, and making sure that most marginalized groups become more part of the participatory process as well as more of the focus. And that indeed, and this is how I would like to end, something that Patricia mentioned, that if we go back to the origin of our intersectionality concept, to Crenshaw, Dr. Crenshaw, Professor Crenshaw, it is about empowering disenfranchised people, and not just statistics, but changes on the ground. And I think that could end my wrap up of this, of the content of this section, of this session. Now, that brings me to the end of this webinar. And I would like to say that this is the fourth in a series of webinars organized by Friedrich Ebert Foundation and White Plus. And I thank you all for contributing. The YouTube will be available. This session will be available on YouTube. I would like to read the briefing papers that will become available. And I would like to thank the audience, but especially the speakers who have contributed so much. And I think I will watch this YouTube video again and again, simply to pick up new elements. As you can see in the chat box, the link for the YouTube is already shared. Yep, that wraps it up, I think. 1 minute to go. So thank you very much the speakers, Dr. Patricia Munoz Cabrera, Sabrina Sasa, and Moana Geneve. Thank you so much for contributing. This was a great pleasure to be the facilitator of the Intersectional Gender Mainstreaming in Public Policy Making seminar. From me, Gisela Duting from Kiev, I wish you all the very best and thank you very much for contributing. And thank you too for the amazing translators that made it possible to have this webinar in Spanish and in French as well. Thank you so much. Bye to everyone.